This is identity engineering, the science and art of reprogramming who you believe yourself to be. And in this show, we'll explore how identity shapes every decision, every emotion, every result, and how you can consciously rewrite it. Because you are not who you think you are. You're who you decide to become.
Welcome back to Identity Engineering. I'm Keith Leonard, and today we're exploring something that affects every single one of us, even the most grounded, self-aware, disciplined people I know. And it's something called identity drift. This is what happens when the person you once decided to be slowly slips out of focus, and not in one dramatic moment, but little by little through the ordinary pressures of life. You know that feeling when you catch yourself thinking, I don't even recognize myself anymore? Or when you realize that you're living on autopilot, saying yes to things when you mean no, or chasing goals that don't excite you, or wearing a smile that doesn't match what you feel inside. That's identity drift. It's subtle, and it usually begins when you stop consciously maintaining who you are. Now, even the strongest identities need maintenance. Think of your identity like a compass. It can port true north, but only if it's recalibrated from time to time. If you ignore it for too long, life's magnetic fields, things like stress, expectations, other people's opinions, all start to pull it off course. And not by a lot, just by degrees. And at first, you may not even notice. You're still moving forward, you're still productive, you're still doing all the things that, quote, someone like you should be doing. But then one day you wake up realizing that your direction has completely changed, and you've drifted miles from where you were meant to be. That's what identity drift feels like. Now look, the human mind is an adaptive machine. It constantly reshapes itself to match its environment. That's what makes us resilient. But that same adaptability can turn against us. When the external world becomes loud enough, or when work demands more of you than your body can sustain, or when success pulls you into new circles that reward performance over presence, or when survival takes precedence over meaning, your brain starts to economize. It turns down the volume on authenticity, and it turns up the volume on efficiency. And you start living from obligation instead of intention. And you stop listening to your inner compass because the noise outside drowns it out. And slowly, you begin to forget who you are. And it isn't because you're lost, it's because you've adapted so well to what everybody else needed you to be. One of the biggest misconceptions about identity is that once you, quote, find yourself, you're set for life. But that's not how it works. Identity isn't something you find, it's something you build and then maintain. Identity is a dynamic relationship between who you've been, who you're becoming, and what your environment is asking of you. And if you don't tend to that relationship, it starts to deteriorate. Just like a neglected friendship or an untuned instrument, identity loses its clarity without attention. That's why people who've done years of professional growth work still experience identity drift. They'll say things like, I used to feel unstoppable. I used to wake up with purpose. I used to feel like myself. But over time, stress accumulates and priorities shift. And the weight of, quote, real life starts to take over. And that identity they built, the one that once felt aligned and powerful, becomes buried under layers of exhaustion, duty, and disconnection. Emotional fatigue is one of the biggest culprits of identity drift. When you're stretched too thin for too long, your nervous system starts running in survival mode. And in survival mode, the brain doesn't care about purpose or authenticity. It cares about getting through the day. And so you start operating from habit, not from choice. And at first, it's subtle. You skip that morning ritual that keeps you grounded. You stop doing those things that feed your energy. And you start saying things like, I'll come back to that when things calm down. But things don't calm down because life expands to fill the space you give it. And suddenly, your days are full, but you feel empty. You're busy, but you're not alive. That's the emotional signature of identity drift. It's a quiet exhaustion that comes from being out of sync with yourself. But here's the good news. If you can drift away from who you are, you can also drift back. In fact, the very moment that you notice something feels off, you're already halfway home. Because awareness is the first correction. The moment that you stop and you say, "This is not me," you've started to reactivate that part of your consciousness that remembers who you really are. So if you've been feeling disconnected, if you've been unmotivated or unsure of your direction lately, you're not broken, you're just due for a realignment. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in this episode. What causes identity drift, how to recognize it, and how to realign with your chosen self before the distance grows too wide. Let's look at what actually causes identity drift. In other words, those invisible forces that slowly pull you away from the person that you're meant to be. Most people think that losing yourself happens suddenly through a crisis or a burnout or a breakup or a major life shift. But often it happens quietly. It's more of a gradual erosion. It's not an explosion. And there are three main currents that cause this drift: stress, social influence, and emotional fatigue. Now, stress is probably one of the most underestimated forces in personal identity. It doesn't just affect your mood, it affects your memory of who you are. So here's what happens at a neurological level. When you're under chronic stress, your brain starts to prioritize survival functions over self-reflection. And so it pulls resources away from your creativity and your long-term vision, and it directs them towards immediate problem solving. Your amygdala, the part of your brain that detects threats, stays on high alert. And so your cortisol levels rise. Cortisol is your stress hormone. And so little by little, your sense of choice begins to get really, really narrow. You start to make reactive decisions instead of intentional ones. And you start thinking in terms of, what do I need to prevent instead of what do I want to create? And that shift from creation to prevention is the first sign of identity drift. Because when your energy is constantly managing threats, you stop investing in your growth. You stop feeling like yourself. Now, even mild everyday stress, that kind that never quite turns off, can shrink your perspective until all you see are tasks, not meaning. You become efficient, but not fulfilled. And you start living to maintain, not to expand. That's when your identity starts to blur. Now, the second force that pulls us off course is social influence. Every person that you interact with is a signal, consciously or unconsciously inviting you to tune to their frequency. Now, humans are wired for connection. We mirror facial expressions, emotional tones, even postures, all in the name of belonging. It's how tribes survive. But that same wiring also makes us vulnerable to identity mimicry. And so without realizing it, we begin to adjust ourselves, our goals, our energy, our values, to fit the environments we spend the most time in. Think about this. If you spend your days in a culture that rewards constant productivity, you'll start to feel anxious when you're relaxing. And if you spend time around people who equate their self-worth with their income, you'll start measuring your own success the same way, even if money was never what motivated you. And if you're surrounded by people who thrive on drama, peace will start to feel unnatural. Any of this sound familiar to you? This is how social environments reshape identity, through emotional resonance. It's not that other people force you to change. It's that you unconsciously sync to the dominant vibration in the room. And unless you deliberately recalibrate, you'll start living someone else's version of what's enough. Now, the third force is emotional fatigue. This is the slow leak that drains authenticity over time. Emotional fatigue happens when your output exceeds your input for far too long. When you give, serve, or perform without replenishing, and when your calendar is full, but your heart is empty, that's when emotional fatigue happens. Now, here's the paradox. Emotional fatigue doesn't always feel like exhaustion. Sometimes it feels like numbness. You don't necessarily feel bad. You just stop feeling much of anything at all. You're functioning, you're doing what's expected, you're showing up, but there's sort of a quiet flatness underneath it all. That's because your nervous system has hit its threshold. When emotional energy runs too low for too long, the body starts shutting down its highest functions. Things like enthusiasm, curiosity, creativity, joy, all to conserve energy. It's like running on an emotional airplane mode. And when that happens, you lose access to the part of you that feels deeply alive. Now, you might still remember your purpose intellectually, but you can't feel it anymore. It's like trying to sing a song that you can't hear. That's identity drift at its purest form. You haven't forgotten your purpose. You've just run out of the emotional fuel needed to access it. So these three forces, stress, social influence, emotional fatigue, they don't exist in isolation. They all amplify one another. Stress makes you more susceptible to social influence. Social influence increases your emotional fatigue, and emotional fatigue reduces your resilience to stress. And so together, they create this feedback loop that pulls you off course. And you might not notice it right away. At first, you just feel busy, and then tired, and then numb, and then disconnected. And then one day, you look back at your life and you think, how did I end up here? When did I stop feeling like me? That's the voice of your higher self, the part of you that still remembers the original coordinates, and it's calling you back. So what do we do about it? How do we notice drift before it becomes disconnection? And how do we steer back when we realize that we veered off course? Well, this is what we're going to explore next. We're going to look at the early warning signs of identity drift, those subtle indicators that your compass is starting to misalign. Because if you can catch those early, you can course correct before the distance becomes too wide to ignore.
If you're enjoying this episode, take a moment to follow the show and share it with someone who's ready for their next chapter. You can also join our identity engineering community. You'll find the link in the show notes. Come be part of this movement because identity doesn't change in isolation. It evolves through connection.
The hardest part about identity drift is that it's rarely obvious while it's happening. You don't wake up one morning and think, oh, I've lost myself. No, it happens quietly, gradually, almost gracefully. At first, everything still looks fine from the outside. The same routines, the same responsibilities, the same image. But inside, something begins to shift. You start to feel a kind of emotional static, like your inner signal is getting weaker. Now, if you've ever felt that sense of disconnect, right, that uncomfortable distance between who you are and how you're living, that's your early warning system trying to get your attention. So I want to help you to recognize those early signs, because the faster you can name them, the faster you can realign with the identity that feels like home. Now, the first sign of identity drift is the simplest, and it's also the easiest to ignore. You stop resonating with your own life. What once felt exciting now feels flat. The things that used to energize you now feel like chores. You look at your calendar and you realize there's nothing on it that actually feeds your soul. Just obligations, things that you've said yes to out of habit. And you might be performing well, you might still be successful, but success without resonance feels hollow. Resonance is the feeling of inner alignment, when your outer actions match your inner values. And when you lose that resonance, it doesn't mean that you're off track entirely. It just means that you stopped listening to your emotional feedback. That gentle tug in your gut that says, this isn't it. Or, your quiet intuition that whispers, there's something more authentic here. Those are signals trying to guide you back. Now, the problem is most people don't interpret that discomfort as guidance. They interpret it as failure. So they push harder in the same direction, trying to restore that feeling through achievement, which only accelerates the drift. So if you're feeling like you've lost resonance, pause, don't push, because reconnection begins in stillness, not in speed. The second warning sign is self-betrayal, and not in a dramatic way. When I talk about self-betrayal, I'm talking about when you say yes when you mean no, or when you stay quiet when something inside of you wants to speak, or pretending that you're fine when nothing's fine, or smiling when something hurts. Every small moment of self-betrayal chips away at your self-trust. And your self-trust is the foundation of your identity. If you break too many of your own boundaries in the name of keeping the peace, your nervous system learns to distrust you. It starts to doubt that you're going to protect yourself. And that's when you start to feel untethered, like your emotions are running you instead of the other way around. Now, every time you abandon what's true for you in order to maintain harmony with others, you're drifting. Not because compromise is wrong, but because chronic self-abandonment trains your identity to believe that your authenticity is unsafe. And if authenticity feels unsafe, you'll perform instead of live. Now, another sign of drift is emotional numbness. This is when you're functioning, you're doing what needs to be done, but you don't feel much of anything. You're not deeply sad, you're not deeply happy, you're just sort of muted. This is emotional overload disguised as feeling calm. And it means your system has been carrying too much for too long, and so it's gone into conservation mode. Now, you might even mistake this numbness for peace at first. It's sort of like a quiet feeling after burnout. But let's be honest, deep down you know the difference. Peace feels open, numbness feels closed. And when you lose that emotional range, when joy, creativity, curiosity stop visiting you, that's not a change in your personality. That's identity drift. That's your indication that your identity is running at low battery. And your solution isn't to force your passion back. It's to recharge your system through rest and reconnection. Another sign is you start confusing your roles with your identity, right? You become the parent, the leader, the entrepreneur, and you forget that you're also a human being beneath those roles. Now, roles are useful, don't get me wrong. They help you to navigate the world. But the moment you start believing that your worth depends on them, you begin to serve the role instead of letting the role serve you. And you start making decisions to protect your image, not your essence. This is when you're performing at a level of who you're supposed to be instead of expressing who you really are. Now, here's the tricky part about this. This often looks admirable. From the outside, you appear to be disciplined, dependable, accomplished. But on the inside, you feel disconnected from anything spontaneous or alive. And if you've achieved something significant and then felt strangely empty afterwards, That's the moment you realize that your role succeeded, but the self went missing somewhere along the way. Now, one last sign of identity drift is the silence of self-reflection. What do I mean by that? You stop talking to yourself internally. You stop asking yourself, how am I? What do I want? What do I need today? That internal dialogue that once kept you aligned grows faint. And you just move from one task to the next, 1 week to the next, without checking in with yourself. You know you've drifted when your mind feels full, but your heart feels empty. So reconnection starts by reopening that dialogue, by remembering that your inner voice isn't a distraction, it's part of your compass. And when that voice goes quiet, identity drift expands. But when you start listening to it again, that's when you start to go back into realignment. Now, identity drift doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It actually means you're evolving at an unconscious level. You're still growing, but you're growing without direction. And the purpose of awareness is to make that evolution conscious again. So if any of these signs resonate, if you felt emotionally dull, stretched too thin, disconnected from joy or creativity, or over-identified with your role or your image, it's not signs that you failed. It's simply feedback. It's your inner operating system telling you, hey, it's time to check in. Let's look at the coordinates and see where we're supposed to be going. All right, so far we've talked about what causes identity drift: stress, social gravity, that slow fatigue that pulls you away from yourself. And we've talked about the early warning signs that let you know you're off course. Now let's talk about what to do about it. Because awareness without action just becomes another form of guilt. Now, once you realize you've drifted, your next step is realignment. And that's where the drift protocol comes in. Now, this is a very simple 3-step process to bring yourself back to center, to remember who you are, and to start living in harmony with that version again. You don't have to reinvent your entire life overnight. All we're going to do is return to what's true. Realign your thoughts, emotions, and actions with your chosen identity. Now, step 1 is to pause. This may sound simple, but it's actually the hardest one. Because when you're drifting, your instinct is going to be to move faster, to fix, to do, to compensate. But you can't realign while you're still accelerating in the wrong direction. So step number 1 is to stop. Slow everything down, take a day, an hour, even 5 minutes, and consciously step outside of your activity. Ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? What am I avoiding feeling right now? And when did I start feeling disconnected from myself? Don't analyze, don't judge the answers, just notice. This is where self-awareness becomes an act of self-respect. Because until you pause, you can't perceive the gap between your current self and your true self. And that's the entire point of this step, to notice the gap without judging it. Just imagine for a minute you're a sailor who's drifted off course. You don't panic. You check your instruments. You look at where you are in relation to where you're meant to be. And you course correct. That's what you're doing here. You're reestablishing a point of orientation, your inner north. Just a few moments of honest stillness can do more for your identity than a year of taking action without direction. Now, once you've paused long enough to notice where you are, step 2 is to reconnect with who you've chosen to be. And identity alignment begins with memory. Not the memory of the past, the memory of intention. Ask yourself, who am I when I'm at my best? What values make me feel alive? What does the real me sound like, feel like, look like? close your eyes for a moment and visualize that version of yourself, not as a fantasy, but as a reality you've already lived before. You felt that clarity, you felt that presence, you felt that alignment before. You're just remembering it now. That's what reconnection is, remembering. Bringing the parts of yourself that have drifted apart back into wholeness. And from that memory, you recommit. Now, recommitment doesn't mean perfection. It means consciously choosing again to act from the identity that you've chosen. It means saying to yourself, I remember who I am. I will live from that place, even if I've wandered. Now, the key choice word here is choice, right? Drift happens unconsciously. Realignment happens deliberately. And so the moment you make that decision, you've already interrupted the pattern. This step is an emotional step because you're not just intellectually reminding yourself, you're emotionally reattaching to your truth. So just take a breath and recognize that decision in your body, because that's where the identity change becomes real, in your physiology, not in theory. Now, once you've paused and reconnected, the third and final step is to recalibrate through aligned action. Because without action, the mind will pull you back to what's familiar. Action is how you anchor your identity in reality. So you can think of this step as creating evidence for who you are. Again, you don't need to overhaul your whole life here. Just start small. Consistent symbolic actions reinforce your chosen identity. So, for example, if you asked yourself, what would the version of me I'm committed to being do today? Maybe they'd wake up and exercise. Maybe they'd have a conversation they've been avoiding. Maybe they'd finally say no to something that's out of alignment with who they are. See, the size of the action doesn't matter. It's the integrity of it that's important. Every action that matches your chosen identity sends a message back to your nervous system that says, this is who we are. And the more evidence you create, the more familiar that identity becomes, until what once felt like effort becomes your new normal. Now, recalibration doesn't happen in a day. It happens when you commit to a rhythm. Pause, reconnect, and act. That's the cycle of alignment. So let's bring all three steps together, right? Step 1 is pause, create space for awareness. Step 2 is reconnect and recommit. Remember who you are and choose it again. And step 3 is to recalibrate through action. You want to anchor your chosen identity through consistent behavior. This is the drift protocol. This is your way to return home to yourself whenever life pulls you off center. Now, if you practice this regularly, it becomes muscle memory, and you'll start to catch the identity drift earlier, even in the smallest micro moments. When your tone changes in a conversation, when your focus shifts from purpose to pressure, or when your body feels tense in situations that used to feel light, you'll start hearing those early whispers of misalignment, and you'll know exactly how to respond. That's what mastery looks like. Not perfection, but awareness, followed by gentle correction. Now, as we're closing, I want to leave you with a simple reflection. When I start to drift, I pause instead of panic. That single intention can change everything. Because when you stop fighting the drift and you start paying attention to what it's trying to tell you, you discover that even your disconnection is trying to guide you home. Identity drift doesn't mean you failed. It's giving you feedback. It's your own system saying, hey, listen, you've outgrown this version of yourself. It's time to upgrade. So, remember, you don't need to rebuild yourself from scratch. You just need to remember who you are and return to it again and again. Now, in the next episode of Identity Engineering, we're going to explore how to engineer belief systems, how to consciously design the internal convictions that make your new identity feel inevitable. But until then, make sure you're pausing often, you're listening deeply, and when you feel the drift, smile, because it means your growth is calling. I'm Keith Leonard, and this is Identity Engineering. Thanks so much for listening.
That's it for today's episode of Identity Engineering. If you found value here, please rate the show and leave a quick review. It helps more people discover this work. You can also learn more about identity engineering by visiting theidshift.com. And remember, the person you want to become isn't waiting for someday. They're waiting for you to begin.